in innovation, I think more or less you need to say no more than saying yes sometimes within an experience. Working in technology for me doesn't mean that everything has to become digital. Sometimes I need to advocate that, oh, by the way, this certain aspect needs to be face to face. As of today, there isn't a framework that treats digital layer within architecture as a layer. It's all digital typically is treated as a furniture.
Assalamu alaikum, first of all. Thank you so much for being here, Mrs. Areej. And
Thank you for
continuing
having
on the conversation and that you were just having, that human-centric design versus systematic centric design, one way or the other.
Okay.
So how did we make that shift from system, and what exactly happened, be it from a historic perspective, our way of thinking as human beings, that we shifted to human-centric designs, so to speak?
Well, there are a couple of factors, right, to kind of think about here. First of all, obviously, the needs of the market have changed drastically. So let's just put a timeline on it, right? So this kind of shift happened in the 90s, right? And the human centered approach, actually, the first record of official record of it was an ISO, actually, that has been published about interactive systems. And then the second ISO came, I think, in 2010, and that this is the one that is typically referenced in most of academic research, or when we want to talk about human-centered design, they refer to that ISO that took place in 2010. And in it, they established, right, standards and policies, right, on how design now needs to cater also to the human needs. Right. Before that, the focus, as we were talking, was about the system needs and what the system allow us to do and what the system allow us not to do. And if you worked in technology, you see this. They used to kind of say, when they write the system requirement, the system does this and that. But now we have this obviously new approach of thinking about a human being. So now we say the user writes this and that. And so it's from the POV of the user, not the POV of the system. And so that shift happened. So one, as I was saying, that it was a backlash against that, let's say, industrial tech setup that was. And then I think when we come to 2010 and on, and until nowadays, I can say that, but I think with AI, obviously things shifted. There comes also products and the growth metrics, and how do you make those products and design more, they grew and they acquire more users, and they retain also more customers. And so you see here, there are two different ways of thinking, users and then customers. And this is where later on the human centered design expanded to a shift happened to also include service design and customer experience. Right. And those are also two kind of different frameworks of operating. Right. So service design focuses on the services. So I'm not selling you an interface. So a human-centered design, when it started, and the human-computer interaction, which focus on the interface. And when we say the interface and when we say a user, we talk about two things in particular, which was usability, how easy to use is this interface, and then safety. So how safe it is, and this has to do with that example I gave you of the peeler, right? Obviously, when you design something like that, you need to think about the safety of the users and so forth. And even, of course, on a software, obviously, you think about those things. That shift happened, right, from an interface to services. No, I'm no longer only giving you an interface. There is a whole service, and then it expanded to also customer experience. Which now we think about the brand perception at different touch points. So I want to give you as a brand a consistent experience. You come into my branch or you come to my application or whatever channel it is, and you get the same experience. And that has to do with retention also and loyalty as metrics, right? You want to retain customers, and then you want to also keep them loyal to the brand, right? And so a human-centered design seemed to have expanded to these also aspects. And whenever you sit with a service designer or a customer experience, they will be referencing that we are a human-centered design, or we follow the human-centered approach.
Mhm. Okay, now this is the point that you just like the multiple ones that you mentioned, but I want to double down on one of these points,
Sure.
which is the point of the human-centric itself. Now, we are at an age, at a level, be it since 2020, let's say after COVID, the human-centric applications design has been almost like a trend. So each and every company say we are human-centric, human-centric, human-centric.
Yeah.
Now, as non-experts, how can we truly determine that this service, product, whatever it might be, truly human-centric or not? Are there certain criteria that we should keep in our mind? Are there certain examples that we reference back to? How do we truly say that this is human-centric? Now it's almost like a trend at the moment, one way or the
Yeah,
other.
I think it has been a trend for a while now. And I think now the current trend has to do more with Gen AI and all of that jazz. But yes, that's true. It has been trending. When someone claims that they are user-centric, you just have to question that. How so?
Mhm.
It's a very simple question. You ask them, how so? You
Yeah.
know, you start with that question. But as for the criteria, I don't think an average user should have a criteria. That's where an expert, right, comes in to kind of evaluate and say, all right, this is where the system, these are the gaps, and this is where the system has those gaps, and this is what we need to address, and these are the good things that are taking a place, and this is what we need to keep. And here are those things that are neutral, that they has to do with our brand, our business. Do we want to have those aspects of the experience, or do we not? So, for example, if you claim to be a sustainable brand, right, users are going to question you when you give them a plastic goods, right?
Okay.
So you need to be consistent as a brand, and that also the same goes for software. I mean, now there is a lot of talk online and discussion about Gen AI and the water, right? It needs a lot of water. It has water, like a huge water consumption. It takes to kind of operate those data centers for the Gen AI.
Really, I'm not familiar with that. Could you please
Yeah.
elaborate?
Well, it's just because recently those data centers in the United States, they discovered, and it's on the news, that they consume a lot of water, and drinkable water, not any type of water.
Oh,
Yes.
filtered water.
Yes, so drinkable. Yeah, so the water that the human beings drink.
Okay.
So that certainly raises a questions, right, about the ethical aspect, right, of this, right. Anyways, that's a whole other conversation to kind of go into, but I just wanted to mention it as an example, is that users, and particularly, let's say, educated users or users who like to be aware, they are going to question the brands, the business brands, about their ethical standing. What do they do, and how do they do it? Think about the brands that has to do with babies, right? The parents would be quite interested in knowing, are these goods organic? Is it good for my children? And bringing this to technology, they always kind of reference Steve Jobs when he said, I have no iPads in my house for my kids, right? And so there is that, this ethical dilemma is certainly there to kind of think about. So I'm mentioning this because I think nowadays businesses and designers have this responsibility also to be ethical, and to kind of bring in those questions within the organization, and not to simply be a designer who fixes the aesthetics of a product or a service.
Such as, like, what's the meaning of that? Fixing the
So typically, as like when I ask you, what is design? What is the first thing that comes to your brain, like an image? Yeah.
me at the moment.
Yeah.
When I say design, I think about visuals, color palettes.
Eh, Exactly. And this is the common kind of image to kind of people have about design, right? But that's not necessarily what design is. That's one type
Aspect. Okay.
of design called visual design, communication design, and graphic design that has to do with all of those sort of things. But now you have very different types of designs that take place. For example, architecture is also a design, right? If you're doing art, that's another type of, let's say, also creative endeavors, right? And so, although there, I need to say there should be a differentiation between what is art and what is design. Those are kind of two different things that we're talking about. But but this is why I'm mentioning it, is because typically people associate design a lot with art. And part of it is artistic, obviously, but there is also part of it that is scientific, and it's about a product works, how a design works. Because at the end of the day, if this door doesn't open,
That doesn't satisfy the goals.
exactly. So no matter how beautiful it is, it might be very aesthetically pleasing, but let's assume it's made from a very heavy material, and it takes like such a force to open it, to open it, that violates design. It doesn't violate art, because by art standards, I have made such a beautiful door.
Yes.
Of course, it's objective, but it's subjective, excuse me. But when it comes to design, there is another type of thinking. It's how usable it is, how functional it is. And of course, there is that aspect of how delightful it is as well. But you need to kind of make sure first it's functional, it opens and it closes, then it is usable. When I open it and close it, it is easy enough. And then actually, I like the store.
And is it safe as well? When it comes to safe?
Obvious, yeah, of course, yes.
You just mentioned something that actually I want to move to, which is like the big chunk of the conversation. I believe it will take the biggest chunk of the conversation, and most of your, let's say, blogs, research focus on that topic. Correct me if I'm wrong. That's that kind of integration between the digital space and the physical space, physical world.
Yeah.
So we've been talking about the human centricity of things. So yes, it's about the human centricity of the apps, the applications, the services, be it digital or non-digital, how safe it is, how usable it is, and so on and so forth. Now it comes the integration. And just before this episode, I've had a recent, just now, in one of the banks, I've had that kind of mismatching between the digital experience and the physical experience.
Yes.
And one being human centric, the other was not so human centric. So I'd like you to talk more about this aspect of integration between these two the integration between these two worlds, and how do they complete each other in that regard.
As I've told you, like I started with human computer interaction, and my both my educational qualifications and also experience started with building interfaces, making sure those interfaces are usable, are nice enough, and the users come back to them. And then throughout my careers, I moved on to service design, and then after that, systems, environments, and this is when I was in the banking, working in the banking industry. And so, funny enough, you're mentioning a similar example. And because of the context of the banking of the bank, it has offline channels and online channels, right? Digital ones and also physical ones, like the branches, like the ATMs, right? That you stop by. All of these are. You need to make sure that your experience is consistent across, right, those channels. And by the way, until now, we are talking design. We're talking customer experience and service design, because technically those two frameworks should help you as an organization to operationalize service design and customer experience into an operating model that helps you keep your channel, something we call an omni-channel experience,
Yes.
right? So when I was working in the banking industry, I noticed this gap because one of my projects had to do with revamping the branches experience, right? Which is kind of a bigger project to take on. And at that time, I needed to bring in different stakeholders from different departments. We're talking the retail people, we're talking the branch people, the staff that works in the branch, the back end people, right, to take care of all of the services that takes a place for the branch. We're talking also about architects and interior designers, branders who will come, because obviously the whole branch need to have the aesthetics of the brand. So all of those people, we came in, and at that time I did a design thinking workshop for them. I guess enough that about the project, but that project, it was a successful one, but it left me with a question. I felt like there was a gap for me, because I was thinking, all right, so I'm a service designer and I'm kind of building, let's say, those service blueprints for this brand, helping the users, helping the staff, making sure that all of those different stakeholders work together well, right, and in a way that is satisfying for them, and also for the KPIs that they need to address at the end of the day. But I noticed that there was a gap between the digital experience and the digital designers, and then the physical space itself. As service designer, I felt like we treated the space, the physical space, as a backdrop, as a background, as a container, right? But when you go to a branch, or let's change that also to a hospital or an airport, your physical space, the building, shapes your experience.
Mm.
It's not in the background. And so that kind of, like there was like this is a question mark in my head. I was like, okay, there is something here. Like there is a gap. Like one day I'll hope to kind of explore it and answer it. But then, of course, life came, and I switched from two different jobs, but that the question remained, and it kind of led me to space syntax. I was researching around, and I saw this theory. It's a theory that has been set in late 70s, early 80s by Bill Hillier and Hansen and their colleagues at UCL University in London, called UCL, and they teach it, and they teach it on both scales: an urban scale, which is like a city scale, or a building scale, an architectural scale. And they accept all sort of students, and or let's say backgrounds, I should say, because I came as a professional. And of course, it was a interesting entrance, because like where's the connection, and for them it was the question, for me it was the question. And later on in my dissertation, it crystallizes to a good question at the end of the day. Maybe later we can talk a little bit about it. But yeah, basically that. I mean, it was that project that started that curiosity. I followed that curiosity and then built on it. And yeah, I guess here we are.
Going back to the project that you just mentioned, and for me, I want to pinpoint, and I'd like you also to, let's say, elaborate on the perspective of how did this question came about. So yes, you find that gap between the physical aspect and the digital aspect, and I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, that depending on certain sectors, the physical experience is much more important than the digital. Like for example, when it comes to airports, I might buy my ticket online, then I will have to go to the airport because I need to go hop on the plane.
Yeah.
But for something like the banks, and again, we might be able to, let's say, duplicate or reflect on other industries. What was the main challenge that you see? For example, the physical people, I'd say physical digital people, the physical people saw, the digital people didn't see, and vice versa. Where was the point of conflicts, so to speak?
I wouldn't. Well, first of all, I wouldn't say that there is one more important than the other. I think there is a dynamic
Mhm.
that those two kind of work with, and when you have different teams, you need to make sure they are all speaking together,
Mhm.
right? So the people in the building, whatever the building is, whether that's an airport, a hospital, a bank, or even a governmental like facility, right, need to understand what's going on with the digital team, and vice versa, right? And it happens, I mean, of course, in mature organizations where they have mature design processes, that happens, that alignment. So I'm not particularly talking about that aspect, because that can be helped by transformational teams, by managerial teams, by what they call silos, right? Departments that live by themselves.
Silos, everyone working
Yeah,
separately. We don't know what
yeah.
we don't know what each other's doing.
Exactly. So this is one aspect, right, that typically happens, and it can be answered by many different managerial things. But what I was interested in was a little bit different, which is, as of today, there isn't a framework that treats digital layer within architecture as a layer. It's all digital typically is treated as a furniture, right, to the architecture, whatever
what
it
way?
is, in a way that there isn't a framework that kind of help them all kind of function together, right?
Okay.
So for example, when an architect firm is assigned a project to do, right, they do their creative process, they launch their processes, all of this happens, and later on, when the design is finished, the digital layer comes in, right? When you bring it to the city is already built, and then we put on the lights, the screens, those different things as pieces, as furniture,
accessories.
well, yeah, I mean, this is why I'm calling them furniture, right?
Okay.
And so I was thinking, all right, now those digital elements within the city or within a building are no longer furniture. They are part of the framework, of the architectural framework, and we need to treat them as such. But in order to say that, we first need to, at least in my research, I needed first to prove that the digital layer actually also helps in shaping the human decisions, their attention, their dwellings, their navigations. How do they actually affect, if at all, the humans within the architectural context?
And what was the main findings that you found on that regard?
So I studied three public squares in London. Those public spaces, they have a digital layer into them. As well, I studied a nearby street that is within the same street network, to kind of do a quasi study, to kind of do like a classic comparison study. And yeah, so I wanted to see how does also keep the track of the human behavior, and as a layer as well, right, within that. And it was really interesting. I mean, I stood for hours in those public squares,
Okay.
collecting behavioral data, and also I had to do the spatial analysis.
Which square
to
was it, if you don't mind?
So three squares. The first one was Leicester Square, in London. It's almost like I don't want to say like a garden, but they call it a square. But it has that vibe. It has a lot of trees, a fountain, a Shakespeare fountain in the middle,
Okay.
and in the summer they put this screen that at that time it showed the Wimbledon tennis matches.
Okay.
Right. So people gather, they sit, they watch the game, or they pass by, right? They take pictures also with the different statues that are scattered around the square. So you see there is a couple of level of interaction that takes place. There is the digital element, there is the statue, the non-digital elements, right?
Okay.
And the fountain,
Okay.
and the public, the configuration of this public space, right? How
Okay.
is it? Then the other one is Covent Garden. Now that's a very quite different one from that, because that has shopping
Aroma or style?
shops, like shops and stores in it. And also they have a lot of performers who come and do performances,
Street performers?
street, yes, performance within it. And they also had that digital also screen placed within it. And then the third one was Piccadilly Circus. I mean, people who went to London, they must pass by that public space, and it has those very large screens that are almost like with the background of the sky, right?
Right.
Yeah, and there isn't, they're not necessarily showing a specific program. It's just about advertisement, right? This is
Okay.
what you kind of see on those
It's a
screens.
public space. It's a good location. Okay.
Yeah. So studying those spaces, right, to kind of understand, all right, how do humans navigate dual, sit, stand, the sociability aspect,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so, and this has to do then to kind of say, so there is this concept, let's say, within space syntax that Bill Hillier kind of started, which called virtual community. Virtual community has nothing to do with virtual as in digital. No,
I was gonna say
I know. Yes.
meta universe. Something.
I know.
Okay.
Yes. No. It doesn't have to do with that. It has to do with fields, active fields of sociability. That the configuration of a certain space, right, can help in co-producing sociability. So, for example, if I'm if we're in a certain, let's say, public space, I may not know you and you may not know me, but since there we have a co-presence, we are aware of each other's as a human beings in a certain physical space, sociability might happen. So
Okay.
there is an active field that may take a place at any second,
Mhm.
and this active field that is going to maybe take a place, a potential one, right, is taking a place because of certain elements. The first one can be visibility, the fact we're visible. You see me, I see you. The integration, how well integrated is this space that is bringing different people to come to this space, right?
Mhm.
And so the notion started with that. And in my research, I hope to honestly to say that I extended that to say the digital layer also add to it and build on top of it, and perhaps amplify it, extend it, depending on the other factors that are also taking a place within that public space.
In what sense?
In sense that, for example, when there is, like, let's say, this digital layer, in some cases it may amplify, so people would gather with a cluster,
Mhm.
right? In other spaces, it may actually decluster them, help them to decluster, right?
Okay.
And kind of go their own separate ways. So in each actually public space, there was a different mechanism that took place that a human beings kind of dwelled on it.
Mhm.
And it depended on what later on in my research we call resilient convex spaces. And these are kind of those spaces that has this visibility, the integration, and also the digital element that amplified or not amplified the human behavior within that space. So these are the three kind of, let's say, I don't want to say measures, but let's say things to keep an eye on, right, within an architectural setting, to say this is actually what is bringing the human beings, what's bringing the movement to take a place. Because at the end of the day, space syntax focuses on studying how people, the movement, how, let's say, this configuration, the architectural configuration, the geometric one, kind of helps the movement and the encounters in a probabilistic way.
Last type you just mentioned. So the other three types you mentioned. The resilient one. The last one you said resilient.
So there are a couple of findings, but one of the findings in my research was that what I'm calling in my research resilient convex spaces, and thus, so a convex space.
Can you give an example of that, if you don't mind, of that resilient space?
It's not necessarily an example
Okay.
to kind of give, but let's say this: there are conditions that you may set in the environment to end up having that type of environment that brings in a human being. So the conditions: the first one, visibility. So, for example, if you're building a certain public space or a building, enhancing visibility, right?
Mhm.
Can help people come in and gather,
Okay.
right? But not visibility by itself, because, for example, in Piccadilly Circus, the visibility was high,
Okay.
but it did not help sociability. One of the findings that it didn't help sociability to happen because the digital layer was treated as a spectacle because it's in
Okay.
the background. It's not necessarily helping, right,
Okay.
in gathering people.
Okay.
While when we go to Leicester Square, because of the nature of how the screen was set up within the architectural context,
Okay.
that helped the movement. So we see here it's visibility, but then there is also the integration. Integration, which basically how well connected this space to the overall network,
Mhm.
right? And then the digital layer comes in. So the way you design your digital layer matters within that architectural because it can help increase the sociability or amplify it, or it can also have absolutely no effect.
Okay. So now go back to that said hours that you study, you stay. Now I'm trying to imagine myself staying there an hour, just like sitting in a chair, like watching people around. It's like kind of stuck. But the point is, during that time, what things did you say that that you were not expecting people to do, and yet they did? Because at first you what please can you say the term again, where you were expecting people to do something?
The affordance.
The fortness.
Yeah.
So fortness of things. So what was the fortness that you had in mind? And when you sat in these spaces for that time and you were observing what people are doing and how they interact with the space, you said, I was not expecting that. I was not expecting that. I was not expecting that. Was there a certain behavior?
So I wouldn't say necessarily that I was expecting anything to begin with as a behavioral researcher. I learned to go with an open mind and no expectations, and to kind of just to track how human beings are acting within a certain environments. But to take it to kind of that affordance, we need to talk. Affordance is a design concept, so we needed to take it, for example, to let's talk about it in architecture. So, for example, there are certain public spaces when they don't want people to sit around, they will create those stumps, but in a way that you cannot sit on it. It might be a little bit more sharper at the edge, right? And so that is, and same goes for sometimes for also the public chairs that you kind of find. That's the opposite thing. You want people to sit, you increase the number of chairs. And I'm mentioning a very basic example here, right? But that increases the affordness of you sitting, for example, in a place or not. There is something interesting. To be honest, maybe when I observe in general, maybe I can say that it's interesting, or I find interesting, is how human beings always use the space as they want to, right? And so people would come, for example, to a square. They will sit around the fountain, for example, although there is no seating. But because it was extra crowded, they would sit around the fountain. So they will be watching from across, right? And they wouldn't come in to kind of sit because they're just passing and they want to kind of watch this game until the player makes the hit, and then go to their way, carrying on with their
Yes.
daily activities. So it's always interesting to see how human beings behave. Another thing that I could also say is interesting is children. The presence of a children, and this is my observation, I'm not claiming it's a factual piece, but it's more of like an observation of mine, is that it always invite playfulness into the place. Because kids in their nature, they like to play around, right? And that helps also people to be more social, because people will make a comment, will start conversations because of those kids. They are playing around with the fountain, and the water and the things around, and so their presence increases safety. So as a human being, when you see kids in a certain public space, you feel more safe. This is one aspect, right? It's let's say an unconscious type of thing that happens to you. There is more safety. Also, I noticed that the playfulness, also people are more likely to be playful in the public space. And like, for example, when you're walking in the street, in a, let's say, in a business district, right? People are more serious. They are carrying their bags, they are carrying their lunches, and they are like going straight to back to their offices or from the cafe. So the feeling, the ambience within certain spaces, it changes, right? And that is a social factor to the sociability, right? And to how also how you design those spaces. Like when you're designing this space, what are you after? What type of conditions you're setting in order to help people have more encounters in the city?
Okay. Now I'd like to go back to one of the concepts that you just mentioned regarding the connection of us as human beings with the building or the physical space. So, as you mentioned, there are multiple layers. You have the design layer, the architectural layer, the human aspect layer. So, correct me if I'm wrong, that from your research or your recommendation is that these layers work in tandem. So, for example, when I'm starting or I'm building a new public building, such as a museum, an airport, or whatever, at that specific moment, the architect should work hand in hand with the service design or the design aspect, digital design aspect too, in order to create kind of a comprehensive journey so that when humans or people interact with that physical space, the digital and the physical space, the physical experience would be kind of coherent with each other rather than separate one way or the other.
Well, what I would say is that the architect need to consider doing spatial analyses, need to consider having more conversations with different teams, right? But I wouldn't say necessarily work hand in hand because that depends on the context and the organization and how they are set up. But what I would say is that having that evidence-based design is always important than just simply carrying it as an artistic endeavor.
What do you mean
Now,
evidence-based design? If you don't mind me asking, evidence-based design. What is that?
so
If you don't mind.
evidence-based design. So we talked a little bit before, like about like the human-centered approach, right, and the
Systematic.
human and
Yes.
human also computer interaction,
Yes.
and in that there came that evidence-based. So let's begin with software, and then I'll go back to architecture. But in let's say in software, and because we started right with design, as we talked about this earlier, right? Like it was about visuals and color palettes and
yes.
the styles, different styles. But then we moved into that evidence-based. Meaning is that when we design something, we need to run certain tests in order to know what are the users' needs and if this is working well, working in a usable way, right? There are so many different tests that you can, conduct for like an interface. For example, a very common one in user experience design is usability testing, right? So that is one way to kind of test. So you're now not designing a website based on the fact that it's beautiful or what you think the website should be like, but you are designing it in a way that is easy to use for different groups. So, for example, if you think about applying to a governmental service, you have older people applying, you have middle-aged people applying, you have people who are, or younger people applying, you have people who are educated, who are not educated, people who are tech savvy, people who are not tech savvy, right? And so for that, you no longer can afford to design based on what you think is good and lovely. You might be a very smart person, but no one is that smart to kind of guess what everybody is going to go be doing around that website. You need that evidence-based approach, right? And this is where all of these frameworks that we kind of talked about before kind of came. Similarly, in architecture, and of course there are even like more people who can speak better than I am when it comes to architecture, history and how kind of it started. But architecture is to a certain level quite dependent on the architect vision of how they see the building is going to be. Now, in contrast, space syntax, that theory that I kind of spent the last year kind of studying, focuses on evidence-based design for architecture and cities.
Mhm.
So it means that we do those studies, those analyses, in order to understand the space and then make design decisions based on the evidence,
Mhm.
not based on what we think is going to be nice. So this is what I mean by evidence-based.
So how do you face that kind of counter argument from like, imagine I'm an architect. I'm saying I'm very far from being an architect, but at the same time, like you're mentioning that, okay, it needs to be evidence-based design. And the architect, one way or the other, that he's that innovative, genius person who looks at things differently. He wants to put something, as you mentioned, very visual, very captivating, mesmerizes the audience, and so on and so forth. And he or she believes that taking that into consideration might limit the way he or she thinks. What do you say to that?
What I would say to an architect is not to think of it as something that is limiting, rather that's something that would expand how they think about the space. Even for myself, right? I don't come from this necessarily this background, and gaining that lens helped me see things in a different way for the users and helped me to enable the users in a different way. So what I would say with them is to entertain it, to have an open mind, and to kind of see, all right, how this can help me, especially when we are talking about designing things within that needs to be functional and needs to serve the human beings in a city,
Mhm.
right? In particular, you kind of need to think about, all right, what am I gonna be doing here? How can I increase a certain engagement, or how can I help more human beings to have fun within this museum? For example, if we're gonna talk about like a certain context, a museum, help that navigation. How can I also help within the crowds management in certain places, right? So in order to kind of answer those questions, I feel like any architect or any designer at some point needs to investigate, to
Mhm.
understand what is happening in real life with the human beings, and also to simply have more info and more data to make better decisions. So what I would say, to think of it as a way to help them or empower them to make better decisions, better creative decisions. I'm not saying
Mm.
that when we're following an evidence-based approach, that doesn't mean that we're not making a creative decisions.
Mm.
These are creative decisions, but they are also evidence-based.
Okay. Now, if you allow me to go back to a certain point that we just mentioned or that we talked about, which is about the human centricity aspect. Now, having that kind of physical slash digital aspect of things, you want to create it in a certain way that for brands, businesses, government, they want to have that smooth experience. With that, do you think that the innovative part within this realm is very limiting, or there is a huge space for innovation, adding up new things, or it would complicate things a bit more? For example, you want to say, uh, I have this building, I have that digital slash physical experience, as a banking industry, a museum, or whatever, and I want to go into that spatial aspect of having that integration between the physical and the digital realms, combining them together. Is there a place for innovation, or is it that now once we integrate with each other, we need to have a certain set of things to do, so that any human being comes into our door, have a smooth experience with no complications, nothing? Because sometimes some people, even restaurants or whatever, the more layers you add, the more steps you add to
Hmm.
reach a certain thing, it creates, sometimes it's more innovative, sometimes it backlashes into more complication.
I see. So doing those sort of things actually may help remove those extra steps,
Mhm.
right? Yeah. When a designer, let's say, is within that context, we actually might advise to lose certain layers. That you're complicating this because you're going back to the users. You see their needs, and so if there is a certain complication that is taking place in reality, obviously that's something that you take back within the organization and you talk about it. So I don't think it's something that limits. I think it's something that expands your horizon. However, there is like, let's say, a point to emphasize, which is you're expanding your horizon, but within that, you need to know how to orient yourself.
Okay.
What's the direction, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so in innovation, I think more or less you need to say no more than saying yes sometimes within an experience. And maybe some people will find this a little bit controversial. But I'm going to take this to an example within the Islamic art heritage. So within our Islamic teachings, for example, we don't like to, or we shouldn't be sketching people, human beings, or bodies, right? And so that is a limitation if you think about it, right? When you see a lot of the European art and their art schools, a lot of it depends on the human form, right? And how it is, and sketching it, and in different ways and different perspectives, right? So you could look at that and think, oh, right. So since we're forbidden to kind of go and sketch like bodies and human beings, that's a limitation. But guess what? It created the calligraphy art, right? It created that geometric Islamic art, right? Where the word was the art itself. The word became the art itself. So creative processes are whimsical and interesting, and you don't know how they necessarily happen sometimes, because like that there was a limitation, but that limitation didn't limit their reality. In fact, it helped them look at art in a very different way,
Mm-hmm.
and do a whole different perspective on art that was suitable to to the teaching, to the values,
Mm-hmm.
right? And despite the fact if someone agrees with those values or not, this is not the takeaway here. The takeaway is to always think, if I have a set of values within my philosophy, or I have a certain philosophy, your philosophy can be limiting or can be actually help you to be innovative. It depends on you and the conditions around you, I believe.
Mm-hmm. Nice. Going back to a point, which is the idea that you mentioned, that kind of limitations, innovation, and physical slash digital experience when it comes to human centricity. You mentioned that project that you have with one of the Saudi banks. Were there any, let's say, projects or case studies that you have seen and you said these projects, these case studies, worldwide or local, have truly found that sweet spot of integration within that human centricity of connecting the connecting the people with that building, with that physical space, using digital experience not as an accessory, but as part of that digital experience? Has there been any case studies with that similar
Um,
way?
I think there are definitely examples, good examples around you can find, whether in software or in physical environments. I think the question is how to replicate that, or how to reach that to begin with. So I focus on that, on the processes, and that um, a question of how to reach to that
But
stage.
what is an example for you that you say, yes, that's a stage that I believe it's a really good stage for any organization to reach? Was there a specific example?
I wouldn't say there is a stage I would like them to reach, but I would say this depends on their context,
Mm,
depends on their what
mm,
they want to do, where do they want to end up, right? W- when you talk about certain experiences, in my opinion at least, I don't think it needs to be a binary conversation of saying this is right, this is wrong, right?
mhm.
It's more of like, is this within the story I'm building?
Okay.
So, for example, if we're going to talk about the story of Harry Potter, right? You have a lot of magical things going on. You can afford to add magical beings,
Mhm,
right? But if we're going to talk about like a classic novel of Dostoevsky, right? You cannot afford to add that magical,
mhm,
let's say, element feature. Why? Because the story, the setup of the story, or the setup of the world is different. A similar thing also goes for those brands, because you need to ask yourself, all of those features might be awesome, but does it fit my narrative? Does it fit my story? And does it fit my users who I hope to attract and retain? So this is where I would say the thinking needs to be.
Okay, but a counter argument might arise saying that I don't want to limit myself to the industry. So, for example, banking industry would find inspiration for the experience from Disney World, and vice versa, or uh, from the museum industry might find an inspiration in the space industry when it
Yeah,
comes to.
and that is
So,
exactly what I'm saying.
exactly. So, in the way that limiting yourself within that industry might not give you that space or that additional, as you mentioned, layer or innovation aspect to help find that sweet spot.
Exactly. Yeah.
So, but are there like certain, for example, going back to the question, is that was there a certain entity or a place, physical space in London or in Saudi Arabia where you, from your perspective, said that this place has managed to find that integration? And again, there's nothing as perfection, but in a way that yes, the integration was there to a certain aspect.
I'm hesitant to mention like an example because
Why?
it's not a matter of a benchmark.
Okay.
It's a matter of finding a process that takes you where you want to go, right? And where you want to go is not necessarily a benchmark. That you might take, of course, inspirations, as you said, and this is exactly how creative process works, right? So from any industries, and you can kind of copy and be inspired from neighboring industries or even further industries. But the question becomes not to try to reach a certain stage, but but rather, in my opinion, to arrive to an experience you want.
Okay. So in a way, so kind of a to rephrase, correct me if I'm wrong, that it's not about finding inspiration. Okay, inspiration is always going to be there, but I'm talking about the idea of finding your own pace on that regard. So it's about trial and error.
Framework, processes,
Mm.
and basically an epistemology, having epistemology, right, in a certain way, which is like, how do I reach where I want to reach,
Okay.
right? Those, in my opinion, are more important questions, because, and why am I, focusing on this, not to mention example, because you find this a lot, I think, if you sit with so many CXers or service designers, UXers, and product managers, all of yeah, people who work within our industry, is that metrics are, everywhere. The fancy terminology is everywhere. Everyone mentions that perfect benchmark that we want to reach and the Northern Star, right? So you hear these terminologies, and this is why I'm hesitant to kind of say this hesitation doesn't come from the fact that there isn't good examples, or the fact that I don't want to share them, but it comes from the fact it's not the right POV to look at design, because you want to reflect inward first to kind of say, all right, what's going on with me inside my organization, and where do I want to end up going, right? And when you ask that question, then you look externally and gather inputs. So I guess this is why I don't want to mention a certain measure or a certain example, because that is not the point. The point is to bring it back to you, your user research that you're conducting, understanding the human beings, right? Bringing, for if it's applicable, the space, right, as a active agent and not as a background, and see how all of those dynamics work and what type of framework you should follow for that.
Now, do you think at a certain stage, now I believe some countries have reached that stage, but I'm talking about Saudi Arabia, all experience talk about that spatial design aspect would be digital first?
That's certainly an interesting question. It is on the rise with emerging technologies, with Internet of Things, with augmented reality, with virtual reality. Once all of those emerging technologies they become more accessible and you find them easier, in the environment and the both digital and physical environment, that will be something to consider, right? But I don't think anyone can speak to that and give you a decisive answer. It's going to be digital first. I think it depends on on what's going to take a place. But I think, to be honest, and that's my opinion as a person, just as a human being, people at the end of the day, they love their physical environments. They want to go out. They want to be connected to the nature. They want to be out and about in the city, to get lost in the city, to see new things, to discover new things. That is thrill. Human beings, they love that. And that I think will always continue. So to me, to be honest, as someone who's a human-centered designer and a researcher, I want to give the users a good balance between the two words, and at the end of the day, also be respectful to the environment. And that's something that we kind of also need to keep in mind, is that also the environment is important, and how to kind of help the environment and stay in a sustainable way living within our organizations, whether those are living organizations or digital ones. Um, with saying that, of course, digital is something that is on the rise, and it's going to take a place. With now, of course, the more I think, once we have good infrastructure for the emerging technologies, I think that would be a definitely a reality that is taking a place.
Mm.
Hence why this conversation I'm bringing between the spatial and the digital becomes even more important in that context.
Mm.
Because as of today, what is the framework that is gonna, guide us around? And I'm not necessarily now talking about policies, but rather about that process and the framework that you can follow in order to create that space that is um, safe, uh, pleasant, and also at the end of the day, does the aim that you have in mind for it.
The reason I brought that up, because during our conversation now, I just remember something I've seen maybe 5 years ago, almost 5 years ago. In China, in some cities, it was very digitally enhanced to the point where some behaviors have changed. So, for example, grocery stores, some groceries or supermarkets, you almost see no one because it's all been transferred online. So everybody started ordering from that grocery store online. The grocery store is open and everyone can come and go, but the behavior has changed. That okay, now it's about when I want to order something, some vegetables, some whatever. I don't need to go drive my car, find the parking spot, and going in buy. I can order like one push of a button, and in a matter of in a certain amount of time, the items come in. Interestingly enough, this has shifted in with all items except seafoods, because part of the human behavior, and especially Chinese, I believe Chinese or Japanese, I need to see the fish or the crab or whatever it is with my own eyes. I need to see the freshness. I need to see that kind of thing. So, do you believe that to a certain perspective, and again, our behavior in certain way has changed, but do you think it will change drastically to the point where anything I want is going to be fully digital? The physical interaction would be minimized to the minimum point possible, whether it's finding the items or whatnot. Even going to a gym, I have my own home gym through an application, and that's it. I don't want to go anywhere else.
I think you kind of have answered the question, right? Because you said, right, with the majority of the items, they wanted to go digital, but when it came to seafood, they didn't, right?
Mhm.
And so this is the insight that your design and research team are going to bring to you as a business and tell you, right, which one to go for digital, which ones to keep non-digital, or at least to have as a hybrid, right?
Mhm.
And so this is, and in my opinion, this is how it should go at the end of the day, is that you need to go back to reality, understand the user's needs, and then bring it back. Because if you wanted to enforce digital, maybe people will follow, but adaptation will decrease at some point, right?
Why so?
Well, if you enforced it, it depends on the context of it. If the human beings, for example, if you wanted to enforce the digital on the seafood, would the users go for it?
Might not.
Exactly. So this is exactly the point here is the fact that you want to go and understand what's going on and then make the decision based on that. Working in technology for me doesn't mean that everything has to become digital. Sometimes I need to advocate that, oh, by the way, this certain
Aspect or
aspect needs to be face to face, right? It's actually, it might be a differentiator for your business
Mhm.
to have. So hence why I'm saying it depends on the context, it depends on your business, it depends also on your philosophy and what you want to do. Now certain, let's say, businesses, they are by nature digital, and that's easy for them to continue as digital. But that doesn't mean that we all have to follow and be fully digital and fully automated just for the sake of being digital.
Mhm.
What you need at the end of the day is to make sure that you have accomplished your business outcomes and you also satisfied your users. As a business, I'm talking now about businesses, right? These
Mhm.
are the two things. You need to make sure you're making money, and then you need to make sure your customers are happy. And in order to do so, it might be digital, it might fully digital, it might be face to face, it might be a hybrid. It depends on the context, and it depends on what you're selling. Is it fish or is it vegetables?
Okay, but going into that aspect is that the human centricity aspect that we have been talking about, and again, it's about that human connection with that space, with that digital experience, and so on and so forth. Do you foresee that at a certain stage? Because again, I believe a lot of times people talk about customer journey. A lot of hackathons have been going around talking about that human centricity aspect, that the human growth, that integration, especially with the digital government. They're moving more towards that digital aspect, toward the automation. That and so for us, and we have already, I believe, we achieved a high KPI worldwide when it comes to digital governance thing. Again, because again, at the end of the day, when I face a problem at the bank or anything, I always want to talk to a human being. So every time I pick up the phone, they tell me, press one to go to that place, press two. I stay for like 5 minutes and then no human interaction at all. I reach to a point of non satisfaction, sometimes even anger. So do you think that there will be a point where us as human beings, when it comes to services, it would be the norm for us to interact with this AI digital experience rather than that physical interaction? And our idea of normal interaction of a space would be digital. I know it's maybe a question that was asked before, but I believe it's a bit rephrased.
I think in both the question you're trying to ask me to predict the future. I don't necessarily know. I think it depends on the context and the culture you are in.
Mhm.
That also plays a role. It also uh, the demographics. Like, are we talking about younger generations? Are we talking about like older generations? There are all of those kind of aspects to think about. Personally, I don't think we're gonna be fully digital, and I don't think that should be a goal to begin with. I think we need to be conscious about what type of experiences we are designing, and they need to be humane, ethical, and also business oriented. So, what is going to happen in the future? I'm not sure if it's going to be fully digital. Maybe it will. Certainly, there is a lot of sci-fi movies about, having that
And
utopian type of city that is fully digital with flying cars.
with AI right now and on the
And
rise,
with,
is this
yes, but I think especially because of Gen AI, I would say we need to pause. We need to think. Not everything needs to be automated, because there are so many recent studies that are taking place about Gen AI and humans. And how let's say that interaction kind of takes place, and there is a serious cognitive load on human beings using Gen AI, right? Because a lot of these products are designed for continuity. The more the user is on, the better it is for the system, because you're on and you're using it. And so they are designed in a way that would keep you on for a long time with no breaks.
kind
And
of
that
addictive?
addictive. And that would certainly have a cognitive load on you, and on so many different types of human beings, right? And so there is something to kind of pause and kind of think about, is that within those experiences, how can we design something that is still obviously digital and, Gen AI or whatever other emerging technology that's taking place. But we need to also think about the user, their cognitive load, their attention spans, and what's going on with them, and how also maybe to design maybe a simple pause within that digital experience that helps you sit back and reflect. So just to mention an example that kind of maybe helps to ground this little bit is, you're talking to or chatting with a Gen AI agent. All right.
Mhm.
The Gen AI agent, you keep prompting and they keep what? Answering you. And the more you prompt, the more they answer, right? And then the thread becomes quite lengthy,
Correct.
right? And so assuming that at some point you were like, oh, like, no, what was the question before, the answer before? And so what do you have to do now?
Going back.
You scroll back, right? You scroll up. You scroll up, and then now you have to do what? Compare between what you last had,
Yes.
the generation that you last had, and then the generation that you had before, and then to make a new maybe prompt or and get a new generated content, right? You see this process. This process has very high cognitive load on the user, and also it puts the responsibility on you, right, to do the comparison and to understand what all of that longer thread and go back to the certain, let's say, pieces to you go back to them, and then you kind of deal with them, and then you prompt back. And so the design here did not help you as a user, right?
Okay.
And so this is where, right, designers come in to kind of say, all right, by the way, this is still all digital, right? But we need to also kind of consider that we may need to give the user some reflection, right, to help them to. So within design, so there are particular, let's say, design tactics or interactions that you can put within the design to help the user pause, do this comparison.
Becomes humans more humane.
Yes, and simply help them, right? To have a better experience, and also at the same time make sure that the experience is still um, usable and pleasant for them, and doesn't have that high cognitive load.
Thank you so much. And is there anything that you believe that you wish to add to this podcast?
Well,
Or something you wanted to say? Please go ahead.
Well, I guess at the end of the day, there are two takeaways I hope people kind of take from this conversation. The first one being is that design frameworks and design theories are many. It's not one. And what particularly people hear about nowadays is the trendy ones that get popularized for one reason or the other. But I would hope, to be honest, and especially from designers, to kind of go ahead and learn more about these different frameworks and try to also kind of come up with their own design processes. I think as a designer, you reach a good mature stage when you have your own design processes and you kind of understand how you go about your craft. I think that is an important takeaway to take. And then the second one is a very simple one. Design is not simply coloring. Design has to do with how you design for humans to take decisions, to think,
And
connect, navigate, duel, and do so many different things. So it's not a matter of coloring, it's a matter of actually orienting people within a system, whether that system is digital or spatial.